Section 00 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. Preface and Life Sketch of Author. Preface. To the Reader. The one particular object in writing this book is to furnish you with an occasional laugh and the writer with an occasional dollar. If you get the laugh, you have your equivalent, and the writer has his. In Uncle Josh Weathersby, you have a purely imaginary character, yet one true to life. A character chock full of sunshine and rural simplicity. Take him as you find him, and in his experiences you will observe there is a bright side to everything. Sincerely yours, Cal Stewart. Life Sketch of Author. The author was born in Virginia on a little patch of land so poor we had to fertilize it to make brick. Our family, while having cast their fortunes with the South, was not a family ruined by the war. We did not have anything when the war commenced, and so we held our own. I secured a common school education, and at the age of 12 I left home. Or rather, home left me. Things just petered out. I was a slush cook on an Ohio River packet, check clerk in a stave and heading camp in the knobs of Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. I helped lay the track of the MK&TRR and was chambermaid in a livery stable. Made my first appearance on the stage at the National Theater in Cincinnati, Ohio, and have since then chopped cordwood, worked in a coal mine, made cross ties and walked them, worked on a farm, taught a district school, made love to the big girls, run a threshing machine, cut bands, fed the machine, and ran the engine. Have been a freight and passenger brakeman, fired and ran a locomotive. Also a freight train conductor and a check clerk in a freight house. Worked on the section. Have been a shotgun messenger for the Wells Fargo Company. Have been with a circus, minstrels, farce comedy, burlesque, and dramatic productions. Have been with good shows, bad shows, medicine shows, and worse, and some shows where we had landlords singing in the chorus. Have played the variety houses and vaudeville houses. Have slept in a boxcar one night and a swell hotel the next. Have been a traveling salesman, could spin as many yarns as any of them. For the past 4 years have made the Uncle Josh stories for the talking machine. The Lord only knows what next. End of section 00. Section 01 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Philip Martin. My old Yeller Almanac hanging on the kitchen wall. I'm sort of fond of reading one thing and another, so I've read promiscuous like whatever come my way. And many friendly arguments come up between me and Mother about things that I've been reading setting round a rainy day. Sometimes it just seemed to me that there weren't no end to books, some made for useful reading and some just made for looks. But of all the different books I've read, there's none comes up at all to my old Yeller Almanac hanging on the kitchen wall. I've always liked amusement of the good and wholesome kind. It's better than a doctor, and it elevates the mind. So often of an evening, when the farm chores all were done, I'd join the games the boys would play. Gosh, how I liked the fun. And once there was a minstrel troupe they showed at our town hall. A jolly lot of fellers, 'bout 20 of 'em all. Well, I went down to see 'em, but their jokes, I knowed 'em all. Read 'em in my old Yeller Almanac, hanging on the kitchen wall. There was Ezra Hopkins, Deacon Brown, and a lot of us old codgers used to meet down at the grocery store what was kept by Jason Rogers. There we'd set and argufy most every market day, chawing tobacco and whittling sticks to pass the time away. And many a knotty problem has put us on our mettle, which we felt it was our duty to duly solve and settle. Then after they had said their say, who thought they knowed it all, I'd floor 'em with some facts I'd got from my old Yeller Almanac hanging on the kitchen wall. It beats a regular cyclopedium, that old-fashioned Yeller book,
and many a pleasant hour in reading it I've took. Somehow I've never tired of looking through its pages, seeing of the different things that's happened in all ages. One time I was elected a justice of the peace to make out legal documents, a mortgage or a lease. Them tricks that lawyers have, you bet I knowed 'em all. Learned 'em in my old Yeller Almanac, hanging on the kitchen wall. So now I've been to New York, and all your sights I've seen. I suppose that to you city folks I must look most awful green. Gee whiz, what lots of fun I've had as I walked round the town, having bunco steerers ask me if I wasn't Mr. Hiram Brown. I've rode on all your trolley cars and hung on to the straps. When we flew round the corners, sat on other people's laps. Haven't had no trouble, not a bit at all. Read about your city in my old Yeller Almanac, hanging on the kitchen wall.
End of My Old Yeller Almanac. Section 02 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh Weathersby's Arrival in New York.
Well, for a long time I had my mind made up that I'd come down to New York, and so a short time ago, as I had my crops all gathered in and produce sold, I calculated as how it would be a good time to come down here. Folks at home said I'd be buncoed or have my pockets picked 'fore I'd been here more'n half an hour. Well, I fooled 'em a little bit. I was here 3 days afore they buncoed me. I suppose as how there are a good many of them thar bunco fellers around New York, but I tell you them thar streetcar conductors take mighty good care on ye. I was riding along, and one of them cars had my pocketbook right in my hand. I 'lowed no feller would pick my pockets and get it as long as I had it in my hand, and it's shut up tight as a barrel when the cider's working. Well, that conductor feller, he just kept his eye on me, and every little bit he'd put his head in the door and say, "Hold fast." But I'm transgressing from what I started to tell you. I was riding along in one of them sleeping cars coming here, and along in the night sometime I felt a feller rummaging around under my bed, and I looked out just in time to see him going away with my boots. Well, I knowed the way that train was a-running he couldn't get off with them without breaking his dern neck, but in about half an hour he brought them back. Guess they didn't fit him. Well, I was sort of glad he took 'em, 'cause he had 'em all shined up slicker'n a new tin whistle. Well, when I got up in the morning, my troubles commenced. I was so crowded up like derned if I could get my clothes on, and when I did get 'em on, derned if my pants wasn't on hindside afore, and my socks got all tangled up in that little fishnet alongside of the bed, and I couldn't get 'em out, and I lost a brand new collar button that I traded Pettingill a husking pig for, and I got my right boot on my left foot and the left one on my right foot, and I was so darn badly mixed up I didn't know which way the train was a-running, and I bumped my head on the roof of the bed over me, and then sot down right sudden like to think it over, when some feller come along and stepped right square on my bunion, and I let out a war whoop you could 'a' heard over in the next county. Well, along come that darn porter and told me I was a-waking up everybody in the car. Then I started in to hunt for my collar button, 'cause I got a right smart store by that button. There warn't another one like it in Punkin Center, and I thought it would be kind of doubtful if they'd have any like it in New York. Well, I see one stuck right in the wall, so I tried to get it out with my jackknife. When along came that darn black jumping jack dressed in soldier clothes and asked me what I wanted, and I told him I didn't want anything particular. Then he told me to quit ringing the bell, 'cause he was a little crazy. I didn't see no bell. Well, finally I got my clothes on, and I went into a room where they had a row of little troughs to wash in, and fast as I could pump water in the darn thing, it run out of a little hole in the bottom of the trough, so I just had to grab a handful and then pump some more. Well, after that, things went along pretty well for a right smart while. Then I ate a snack out of my carpet bag and felt pretty good. Well, that train got to running slower and slower till it stopped at every house, and when it come to a double house, it stopped twice. I had my ticket in my hat, and I put my head out the window to look at something when the wind blew my hat off and I lost the darned old ticket. Well, the conductor made me buy another one. I had to buy 2 tickets to ride once, but I fooled him. He don't know a darn thing about it, and when he finds it out, he's going to be the maddest conductor on that railroad. I got a round-trip ticket, and I ain't going back on this darn old road. When I got off the ferry boat down here, I commenced to think I was about the best-looking old feller what ever come to New York. There was a lot of fellers down there with buggies and carriages and one thing and another, and just the minute they seen me, they all commenced to holler, "Handsome, handsome." I didn't know I was so darn good-looking. One feller tried to get my carpet bag, and another tried to get my umbrella, and I just told them to stand back, or darned if I wouldn't take a wrestle out of one or two of them. Then I asked one of them if he could haul me up to the Stuyvesant Hotel, and by gosh, I never heard a feller stutter like that feller did in all my life. He said, "Yes, sir," and I said, "Well, how much are you going to charge me?" And he said, 50 cents. And I said, "Well, I guess I'll ride with you, but don't stop to talk about it anymore, 'cause I'd kind of like to get there." Well, we started out, and when we stopped, we was way up at the other end of town where there weren't many houses, and I said to him, "This here ain't the Stuyvesant Hotel?" And he said, "No, sir." I said, "Why didn't you let me out at the hotel like I told you?" And he said, "Because I couldn't say whoa quick enough." Well, I had a great time with that feller, but I got here at last.
End of Uncle Josh Weathersby's Arrival in New York. Section 03 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in Society.
Well, I didn't suppose when I come down here to New York that I was going to flop right into the middle of high-toned society, but I guess that's just about what I done. You see, I had an old friend a-living down here named Henry Higgins, and I wanted to see Henry mighty bad. Henry and me, we was boys together down home at Punkin Center, and I hadn't seen him in a long time. Well, I got a feller to look up his name in the city almanac, and he showed me where Henry lived, way up on a street called Avenue 5. Well, when I seen Henry's house, it just about took my breath away. I was that clar shot back. Henry's house is a good deal bigger'n the courthouse at Punkin Center. Well, at first I didn't know whether to go in or not, but finally I mustered up my courage, and I went up and I rang some newfangled doorbell. When a feller in knee breeches on come out and wanted to know who it was I wanted to see. Gosh, I couldn't say anything for about a minute. That feller just looked to me like a picture I'd seen in a storybook. Well, finally I told him I wanted to see Henry Higgins, if it was the same Henry I used to know down home at Punkin Center. Well, I guess Henry, he must have heard me talking, 'cause he just come out and grabbed me by both hands and said, "Why, Josh Weathersby, how do you do? Come right in." Well, he took me into the house and introduced me to more women folks than I ever seen before in all my life at one time. I guess they was having some kind of society doings at Henry's house. One old lady said to me, "My dear Mr. Weathersby, I am so pleased to meet you. I've heard Mr. Higgins speak about you so often." Well, by chowder, I got to blushing so it come pretty near to setting my hair on fire. But I said, "Well, now, I'm right glad to know you. You kind of put me in mind of old Nancy Smith down home. And Nancy, she's been trying to get married past 40 seasons that I can remember on." Well, Henry, he took me off into a room by myself, and when I got on my store clothes and my new calfskin boots, I tell you I looked about as scrumptious as any of them. Well, they had a dance. I think they called it a cotillion, and that was where I was right to hum. I just hopped out on the floor, balanced the partners, swung on the corners, and cut up more capers than any young feller there. It just looked as if all the ladies wanted to dance with me. One lady wanted to know if I danced the German, but I told her I only danced in English. Well, after that we had something to eat in the dining room, and I hadn't any more got sot down and got to eating right good when that darn fool with the knee breeches on insulted me. He handed me a little wash bowl with a towel around it, and I told him he didn't need to cast any insinuations at me, 'cause I washed my hands afore I come in. If it hadn't been in Henry's house, I'd have took a wrestle out of him. Well, they had a lot of furrin dishes, something what they called beef all over mud, and another what they called a Charlotte Arusha, little shaving mug made out of cake and full of sweetened lather. Well, that was mighty good eating, though it took a lot of them. They wasn't very filling. Then they handed me something what they called ice cream. Looked to me like a hunk of Castile soap. Well, I stuck my fork in it and tried to bite it, and it slipped off and got inside my vest. And in less than a minute I was froze from my chin to my toes. I guess I cut a caper at Henry's house.
End of Uncle Josh in Society. Section 04 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in a Chinese Laundry. I suppose I got tangled up the other day with the doggonedest looking critter I calculate I ever seen in all my born days, and I've been around pretty considerable. I'd seen all sorts of curiosities and monstrosities in circuses and menageries, but that was the first time I'd ever seen a critter with his head and tail on the same end. You see, I said to a feller, "Now whereabouts in New York do you folks get your washing done?" When I left home to come down here, I allowed I had enough with me to do me, but I've stayed here a little longer than I calculated to. And if I don't get some washing done pretty soon, I'll have to go and jump in the river. Well, he was a obliging sort of feller, and he told me there was a place round the corner where a feller done all the washing. So I went round, and there was a sign on the winder that said hop quick or hop soon or jump up and hop or some other kind of darn hop, and then there was a lot of figures on the winder that I couldn't make head nor tail of. It just looked to me like a chicken with mud on its feet had walked over that winder. Well, I went in to see about getting my washing done, and gosh all spruce gum, there was one of them pigtailed heathen Chinese. He just looked for all the world like a picture on Aunt Nancy Smith's teacups. I was sort of sot back for a minute, 'cause I said to myself, I don't s'pose this darn critter can talk English, but seeing as how I'm in here, I might as well find out. So I told him I'd like to get him to do some washing for me, and he commenced to talking some outlandish lingo. Sounded to me like cider running out of a jug. Something like tung uwang fang kai mu ungu wee very good washi. Well, I understood the last of it and just took his word for the rest. So I give him my clothes, and he give me a little yeller ticket that he painted with a brush what he had, and I'll just bet a yoke of steers agin the holler in a log that no living mortal man could read that ticket. It looked like a fly had fell into the ink bottle and then crawled over the paper. Well, I showed it to a gentleman what was a-standing there when I come out, and I said to him, "Mister, what in thunder is this here thing?" And he said, "Well, sir, that's a sort of a lottery ticket. Every time you leave your clothes there to have 'em washed, you get one of them tickets, and then you have a chance to draw a prize of some kind." So I said, "Well, now I want to know how much is this blamed thing worth?" And he said, "I suppose about 10 cents. And I told him if he wanted my chance for 10 cents, he could have it. I didn't want to get tangled up in any lottery gambling business with that saucer-faced scamp. So he give me 10 cents, and he took the ticket, and in a couple of days I went around to get my washing. And that pig-tailed heathen, he wouldn't let me have 'em, 'cause I'd lost that lottery ticket.
So I said, "Now look here, Mr. Hopsoon, if you don't hop around and get me my collars and cuffs and other clothes what I left here, I'll be darned if I don't flop you in about a minute." "I will, by chowder." Well, that critter, he commenced hopping around and talking faster'n a buzz saw could turn, and all I could make out was, "Me song lay tong me lo lo long lay him say me ticky." Well, I seen just as plain as could be that he was a trying to swindle me out'n my clothes, so I made a grab for him, and in less'n a minute we was a rolling around on the floor. First I was on top, then Mr. Hopsoon was on top, and you couldn't have told which one of us the pigtail belonged to. We upset the stove and kicked out the winder, and I set Mr. Hopsoon in the wash tub. And when I got out of there, I had somebody's washing in one hand and about 5 yards of that pigtail in t'other, and Mr. Hopsoon, he was standing there yelling, "Wa mosi konkai liku yung yung awi police, police, police." I had quite a time with that heathen critter.
End of Uncle Josh in a Chinese Laundry. Section 05 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in a Museum.
When I was in New York one day, I was walking along down the street when I come to a theater or play doings of some kind or other. So I got to looking at the pictures, and I noticed where it said only 10 cents to go in, and I allowed I might as well go in and see it. Well, I don't suppose I'd been there over 5 minutes afore I made myself the laughing stock of every one in there. I noticed a feller a-sottin' there getting his boots blacked, and there was a darn little pickpocket a-picking his pockets. Well, I didn't want to see him get robbed, so I went right up to him and I said, "Look out, mister, you are getting your pockets picked." Well, sir, that darn cuss never said a word, and everybody commenced to laugh. I looked round to see what they was a-laughing at, and it warn't no man at all, nothing only a darn old wax figger. I never felt so darn foolish since the day I popped the question to Samanthy. Well, then I looked around a spell longer, and there was a feller what they called the human pin cushion, and he was stuck chock full of needles and pins and looked like a hedgehog. He'd be a mighty handy feller at a quilting. Well, then a feller come along and said, "Everybody over to this end of the hall." Well, I went along with the rest of 'em, and darn my buttons if there weren't a feller that had more pictures painted on him than there are in a storybook. Well, I just got to looking at him when that feller what had charged said, "Right this way, everybody," and we all went into where they was having the theater doings. And I got sot down, and a feller come out and sung a song I hadn't heard since I was a youngster. Near as I can remember, it sort of went this way. "Kind friends, I hadn't had but one sleigh ride this year, and I come within one of not being here. The facts I'll relate near as I can remember. It happened sometime about last December. Lee-too-ra-loo-ra-loo, lee-too-ra-loo-ra-ride-o." The load was composed of both girls and boys, all trying to outdo the other in noise, and the way that we guarded agin the cold weather was setting all spoon fashion together. Lee-too-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-too-ra-too-ra-lido. Well, they had a parrot in that place, and the way he sputtered and jabbered and talked, he was a whole show all to himself. Well, I bought one of them birds from a feller one time. He said it was a good talker. Well, I took it home and had it about 3 months, and it never said a darn word. I put in most of my spare time trying to get it to say Uncle Josh, but the darn critter wouldn't do it. So I got mad at him one day and throwed him out in the barnyard amongst the chickens and left him there. Well, when I went out the next morning, I tell you there was a sight. half of them chickens was dead, and the rest of 'em was scared to death, and that darn parrot had a rooster by the neck up agin the barn, and just a giving him an awful whipping, and every time he'd hit him and say, 'Now, you say Uncle Josh, gol darn ye, you say Uncle Josh.'"
End of Uncle Josh in a Museum. Section 06 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in Wall Street.
I used to read in our town paper down home at Punkin Center a whole lot about Wall Street and them bulls and bears and one thing and another. So I just said to myself, "Now, Joshua, when you get down to New York City, that's just what you want to see." Well, when I got down to New York, I got a feller to show me where it was, and I'll be darned if I know why they call it Wall Street. It didn't have any wall around it. I walked up and down it about an hour and a half, and I couldn't find any stock exchange or see any place for watering any stock. I couldn't see a pig, nor a cow, nor a sheep, nor a calf, nor anything else that looked like stock to me. So finally I said to a gentleman, "Mister, where do they keep the menagerie down here?" He said, "What menagerie?" I said, "The place where they've got all them bulls and bears a-fighting." Well, he looked at me as though he thought I was crazy, and I guess he did. But he said, "You come along with me. Guess I can show you what you want to see." Well, I went along with him, and he took me up to some public institution. Near as I could make out, it was a lunatic asylum. Well, he took me into a room about 2 acres and a half square, and there was about 2,000 of the craziest men in there I ever seen in all my life. The minute I sot eyes on them, I knowed they was all crazy, and I'd have to humor them if I got out of there alive. One feller was a-standing on the top of a table with a lot of papers in his hand and a-yelling like a Comanche Injun, and all the rest of them was trying to get at him. Finally, I said to one of 'em, "Mister, what are you a-trying to do with that feller up there on the table?" And he said, "Well, he's got 5,000 bushels of wheat, and we are trying to get it away from him." Well, just the minute he said that, I knowed for certain they was all crazy, 'cause nobody but a crazy man would ever think he had 5,000 bushels of wheat in his coat and pants pockets. Well, when they wasn't a-looking, I got out of there, and I felt mighty thankful to get out. There was a feller standing on the front steps. He had a sort of a uniform on. I guess he was superintendent of the institution. He talked pretty sassy to me. I said, "Mister, what time does the first car go up from town?" He said, "The first one went about 25 years ago." I said to him, "Is that my car over there?" He said, "No, sir, that car belongs to the Streetcar Company." I says, "Well, guess I'll take it anyhow." He says, "You better not. There's been a good many cars missed around here lately." I said, "Well, now, I want to know, is there anything around here any fresher than you be?" He said, "Yes, sir. That bench you're a-sotting on is a little fresher. They painted it about 10 minutes ago." Well, I got up and looked down, and darned if he wasn't right.
End of Uncle Josh in Wall Street. Section 07 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh and the Fire Department.
One day in New York, I thought I'd write a letter home. Well, after I got it all writ, I said to the landlord of the tavern, "Now, whereabouts in New York do you keep the post office?" And he said, "What do you want with the post office?" So I told him I'd just writ a letter home to Mother and Samantha Ann, and I'd like to go to the post office and mail it. And he told me, "You don't have to go to the post office. Do you see that little box on the post there on the corner?" I allowed as how I did. Well, he says, you just go out there and put your letter in that box and it will go right to the post office. I said, well, now, gee whiz, ain't that handy? Well, I went out there and I had a good deal of trouble in getting the box open. And when I did get it open, there weren't any place to put my letter. There was a lot of notes and hooks and hinges and a lot of reading. It said, pull on the hook twice and turn the knob or something like that. I couldn't just rightly make it out. Well, I yanked on that hook till I thought I'd pull it out by the roots, but I couldn't get the darn thing open. Then I turned on the knob 2 or 3 times, and that didn't do any good, so I pulled on the hook and turned on the knob at the same time. And just then I think all the fire bells in New York commenced a ringing all to once. Well, I looked around to see where the fire was, and a lot of the fire engines and hook and ladder wagons come a-galloping up to where I stood. And they had a big soda water bottle on wheels, and it busted and squirted soda water all over me. Well, one of them fire fellers, looking just like I'd seen them in pictures in Ezra Hoskins' insurance papers, he come up to me madder'n a hornet, and he said, what are you trying to do with that box? So I told him I'd just read a letter home, and I was a-trying to mail it. He said, why, you darn old greenhorn, you've called out the whole fire department of New York City. Well, I guess you could have knocked me down with a feather. I said, well, you're a pretty healthy-looking lot of fellers. It won't hurt you any to go back, will it? Well, he said, there's your letter box over on the other corner. Now you let this box alone. Well, they all drove away, and I went over to the other box, but I didn't know whether to touch it or not. I didn't know, but maybe I'd call out the state legislator if I opened it. Well, while I was a-standing there, a feller come along and looked all around, and when he thought they weren't anybody watching him, he opened that box and commenced taking the letters out. Well, I'd heard a whole lot about them post office robbers when I was postmaster down home in Punkin Center, so I just arrested him right there. I took him by the nape of the neck and flopped him right down on the sidewalk and sot on him. I hollered, murder, police, and every other thing I could think of. And a lot of constables and town marshals come a-running up, and one of them said, what are you holding this man for? And I told him I'd caught him right in the act of robbing the United States Post Office, and by gosh, I arrested him. Well, they all commenced a-laughing, and I found out I'd arrested one of the postmasters of New York City. I lost Mother's letter, and she never did get it.
End of Uncle Josh and the Fire Department. Section 08 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in an Auction Room.
I'd seen a good many funny things in New York at one time and another, so the last day I was there, I was a-packing up my traps and getting ready to go home when I just concluded I'd go out and buy something to remember New York by. Well, I was walking down the street when I come to a place where there was auctioneering off a lot of things. I stopped to see what they had to sell. Well, that place was just chock full of old-fashioned curiosities. I saw an old book there. They said it was 500 years old, and it belonged at one time to Louis the 17th or 18th or some of them old rascals. Derned if I believe anybody could read it. Well, I commenced to bidding on different things, but it just looked as though everybody had more money than I did, and they sort of outbid me. But finally they put up an old-fashioned sugar bowl for sale, and I wanted to get that mighty bad, 'cause I thought as how Mother would like it first rate. Well, I commenced a bidding on it, and it was knocked down to me for $3.50. I put my hand in my pocket to get my pocketbook to pay for it, and by gosh, it was gone. So I went up to the feller that was a-selling the things, and I said, now look here, mister, will you just wait a minute with your going at 35, make it 35 once, twice, 3 times a going? And he said, well, now, what's the matter with you? And I said, there's matter enough, by gosh. When I come in here, I had a pocketbook in my pocket, had $50 in it, and I lost it somewheres around here. I wish you'd say to the feller what found it that I'll give $5 for it. Another feller said, make it 10. Another said, give it 20. And another said, go you 25. Derned if I know which one of 'em got it. When I left, they was still a-bidding on it. Advice. Advice is something the other feller can't use, so he gives it to you. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Uncle Josh in an Auction Room. Section 09 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh on a Fifth Avenue bus. I was always sort of fond of riding, so I guess while I was down in New York I rode on about everything they've got to ride on there. I was on hoss cars and hot air cars and them skylight elevated roads. Well, I had just about come to the conclusion that every street in New York had a different kind of a streetcar on it, but I found one that didn't have cars of any kind. I think they call it Avenue 5. Well, I was standing there one day watching the people and the things go by when all to once along come the darndest looking contraption I calculate I ever seen in my life. It was a sort of a wagon, kind of a cross between a bandwagon and a hayrack, and it had a pair of stairs what commenced at the hind end and rambled around all over the wagon. I said to a gentleman standing there, Mister, in the name of all that's good and bad, what do you call that thing? He said, well, sir, that's a Fifth Avenue bus. I said, well, now, I want to know, can I ride on it? And he said, you can if you got a nickel. Well, I got in and sat down, and I just about busted my buttons a-laughing at things what happened in that bus. There was a young lady come in and sat down, and she had a little valise in her hand about a foot square. Well, she opened the valise and took out a purse and shut the valise. Then she opened the purse and took out a dime and shut the purse, opened the valise and put in the purse and shut the valise. Then she handed the dime to a feller sitting out on the front of the bus, and he gave her a nickel back. Then she opened the valise and took out the purse, shut the valise and opened the purse, put in the nickel and shut the purse, opened the valise and put in the purse and shut the valise, and then said, stop the bus, please. Well, I had to snicker right out, though I done my best not to, but I just couldn't help it. I didn't have any small change, so I handed the feller a $5 bill. Well, that feller just sat and looked at it for a spell. Then he said, whoa, stopped the horses, come around to the hind end of the bus, and he said, who give me that $5 bill? I said I did, and it was a good one, too. He said, well, you come out here. I want to see you. Well, I didn't know what he wanted, but I just made up my mind if he indulged in any foolishness with me, I'd flop him in about a minute. Well, I got out there, and he said, now look here, honest Injun, did you give me that $5 bill? I said, yes, sir, that's just what I done. And he said, well, now, which one of the hosses do you want? Gosh, I don't believe I'd get him $5 for the whole darned outfit. Ambition, something that has made one man a senator and another man a convict. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Uncle Josh on a Fifth Avenue bus. Section 10 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in a department store. One day, while I was in New York, I said to a feller, now where can I find one of them stores where they have pretty near everything to sell what there is on earth? And he said, I guess you mean a department store, don't you? I said, well, I don't know about that. They may sell departments at one of them stores, but what I want to get is some muslin and some calico. Well, he showed me which way to go, and I started out and was walking along down the street looking at things when some feller throwed a banana peeling on the sidewalk. Well, now, I don't think much of a man what throws a banana peeling on the sidewalk, and I don't think much of a banana what throws a man on the sidewalk neither. Well, by chowder, my foot hit that banana peeling, and I went up in the air and come down kerplunk. And for about a minute I seen all the stars what astronomy tells about, and some that hain't been discovered yet. Well, just as I was picking myself up, a little boy come running across the street, and he said, "Oh, mister, won't you please do that again? My mother didn't see you do it." Well, I wish I could have got my hands on that little rascal for about a minute, and his mother would have seen me do it. I found one of them stores finally, and I got on the inside and told a feller what I wanted, and he sent me over to a red-headed girl, and she sent me over to a bald-headed feller. She said he didn't have anything to do, only walk the floor and answer questions. Well, I went up to him and I said, "Mister, I'm sort of a stranger round here. Wish you'd show me around till I do a little bargaining." And he said, "Oh, you get out. You got hayseed in your hair." Well, I just looked at that bald head of his'n and I said, "Well, now, you hain't got any hayseed in your hair, have you?" Everybody commenced a laughing and he got pretty riled, so he said, smart like, "Just step this way, please." Well, he showed me around, and I bought what I wanted, and when I come to pay the feller what I had to pay, it didn't look as though I was a-going to get any of my money back. I handed him a $10 bill, and he just took it and put it in a little basket and hitched it onto a wire, and the darn thing commenced running all over the store. Well, now, you can just bet your boots I lit out right after it. I chased it up one side and down the other. I knocked down 5 or 6 women clerks, and I upset 5 or 6 bargain counters. I took a wrestle out of that bald-headed feller, and just then someone commenced to holler, "Cash!" And I said, "Yep, that's what I'm after." Well, I chased that darn little basket around till I got up to it, and when I did, I was right there where I started from. Gee whiz, I never felt more foolish in my life.
Prosperity consists principally of contentment, for the man who is contented is prosperous in his own way of thinking, though his neighbors may have a different opinion. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Uncle Josh in a Department Store. Section 11 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh's comments on the signs seen in New York.
I seen a good many funny things when I was in New York, but I think some of the signs what they got on some of the buildings are about as funny as anything I ever seen in my life. I was walking down the street one day and I seen a sign. It said, "Quick Lunch." Well, I felt a little hungry, so I went into the restaurant or boarding house or whatever they call it, and they had some signs hanging on the walls in there that just about made me laugh all over. I noticed one sign said, "Put your trust in the Lord," and right under it was another sign what said, "Try our mince pies." Well, I tried one of them, and I want to tell you right now, if you eat many of them mince pies, you want to put your trust in the Lord. Well, I got out of there and I walked along for quite a spell, and finally I come to a store what had a lot of red, white, and blue, and yeller, and purple lights in the window. Well, I stopped to look at it 'cause it was a purty thing, and they had a sign in that window that just tickled me. It said, "Frog in your throat, 10 cents. I wouldn't put one of them critters in my throat for $10. Well, just a little further up the street I seen another sign what said, "Boots blacked on the inside." Now, any feller what gets his boots blacked on the inside ain't got much respect for his socks. I get mine blacked on the outside. Then I come to a sign what had a lot of electric lights shining on it, and I could read it just as plain as day, so I happened to turn around, and when I looked at that sign again, it weren't the same sign at all. And just then it changed right in front of my very eyes, and I come to the conclusion that some feller on the inside was a turning on it just to have fun with folks, so I come away. But I had a mighty good laugh or two watching other folks get fooled, 'cause it would turn first one way and then t'other, and 'fore you could make up your mind what it was, the darn thing wouldn't be that at all. A little further up the street I seen a sign what said, "This is the door." Now any darn fool could see it was a door. And then I seen another sign what said, "Walk in." Well, now I wonder how in thunder they thought a feller was a-going to come in, on horseback or on a bicycle or how. And then I seen another sign, it was in a winder, and had a lot of tools around it, and the sign said, "Cast iron sinks." Well, now, any darn fool what don't know that cast iron sinks ought to have someone feel his head and find out what ails him. End of Uncle Josh's comments on the signs seen in New York.
Section 12 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh on a Streetcar.
Now, I'll just bet I had more fun to the square inch while I was in New York than any old feller what ever broke out of a New England smokehouse. I had a little the darndest time a-riding on them streetcars what they got there. Well, I wa'n't a-riding on 'em near as much as I was a-running after 'em trying to catch 'em. Gosh, I was a-running after streetcars and fire engines and every darn thing with red wheels on it. I calculate I run about 1.5 miles after a feller one day to tell him the water what he had in his wagon was all leaking out, and when I caught up to him, I found out it was a darn old sprinkling cart. Well, I got on one of them streetcars one day, and it was pretty crowded, and there warn't any place for me to sit down, so I had to hang on one of them little harness straps alongside of the car. So I got hold of a strap, and I was hanging on when the conductor said, "Old man, you're going to be in the road there. You better move up a little further." Well, I moved up a little ways, and I stepped on a feller's toe, and gee whiz, he got madder'n a wet hen. He said, "Can't you see where you're a-stepping?" I said, "I guess I can, but you brought them feet in here, and I've got to step somewhere." Well, everyone began to laugh, and the conductor said, "Old man, you're making too much trouble. You'll have to move forward again." And I got off in the gosh darn old car. I paid him a nickel to ride, but I guess I might as well have walked. I was a-walking pretty much all the time I was in there. Well, I got onto another car, and I got sot down, and I never laughed so much in all my life. Up in one end of the car there was a little slim lady, and right alongside of her was a big fleshy lady. And it didn't look as though the little slim lady was getting more'n about 2 cents and a half worth of room. So finally she turned around to the fleshy lady and said, "They ought to charge by weight on this line." And the big lady said, "Well, if they did, they wouldn't have stopped for you." Gosh, I had to snicker right out loud. There was a little boy a-sotting alongside of the big lady, and 3 ladies got into the car all at once, and there weren't any place for them to sit down. So the big lady said, "Little boy, you ought to get up and let one of them ladies sit down." And the little boy said, "You get up, and they can all sit down." Why, by that time your uncle was a-laughing right out. Sotting right alongside of me was a lady, and she had the purtiest little baby I calculate I ever seen in all my born days. I wanted to be sociable with the little feller, so I just sort of waved my hand at him and said, "Howdy do, baby?" And that lady just looked at me scornful like and said, "Rubber." Well, I was never more sot back. I guess you could have knocked me down with a feather. I thought it was a genuine baby. I didn't know the little thing was rubber. Well, I noticed up in one end of the car there was a little round machine, and the conductor had a clothesline tied to it. And every time he got a nickel, he'd yank on that clothesline, and first it said in, and then it said out. I couldn't tell what all them little ins and outs meant, but I just come to the conclusion it showed how much the conductor was in and the company was out. Well, I got to talking to that feller on the front end of the car, and he was a pretty nice sort of a feller. He showed me how everything worked and told me all about it. Well, when I got off, I said, "Goodbye, mister. Hope I'll see you again sometime." And he said, "Oh, I'll run across you one of these days." I told him, by gosh, he wouldn't run across me if I seen him a-coming.
End of Uncle Josh on a Streetcar. Section 13 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. My first pair of copper-toed boots. There's a feeling of pleasure mixed in with some pain that over my memory scoots when I think of my boyhood days once again and my first pair of copper-toed boots. How our folks stood around when I first tried them on and bravely marched out on the floor, and father remarked, "They're a mighty good fit and the best to be had at the store." That night I remember I took them to bed with the rest of us little galoots, and among other things in my prayers which I said was a reference to copper-toed boots. And then in the morning the first one on hand was me and my new acquisition, and there wasn't a spot in the house that I missed, from the garret clear down to the kitchen. Then with feelings expanding and hunting for room, I concluded I'd help do the chores, for I felt as though something was going to bust if I didn't get right out of doors. But those boots, they were new, and the ice it was slick, and I couldn't get one way or t'other. And I just had to stand right there in one spot and holler like thunder for mother. But trouble's a blessing sometimes in disguise, for I learned right there on the spot that the best sort of knowledge to have in this world is that by experience taught. So though many years have passed away and I've ventured on various routes, I'm still trying things just as risky today as my first pair of copper-toed boots. End of My First Pair of Copper-Toed Boots. Section 14 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh in Police Court. I never was in a town in my life what had as many courthouses in it as New York has got. It just seemed to me like every judge in New York had a courthouse of his own, and most of them courthouses seemed to be alongside of some market house. There was the Jefferson Market Court and the Essex Market Court and several other courts and markets and courts I can't remember now. Well, I used to be Justice of the Peace down home at Punkin Center, and I was a little anxious to see how they handle law and justice in New York City. So one morning I went down to one of them courthouses, and there was more different kinds of people in there than I ever seen afore. There was all kinds of nationalities. Norwegians and Germans and Swedes, Hebrews and Scandinavians, Irish and colored folks, old and young, dirty and clean, good, bad, and worse. The judge, he was a-sotting up on the bench and a-saying, 10 days, $10. Geary Society, Foundling Asylum, case dismissed, bring in the next prisoner, and the Lord only knows what else. Well, some of the cases they tried in that courthouse made me snicker right out loud. They brought in a little Irish feller, and the judge said, "Prisoner, what is your name?" And the little Irish feller said, "Judge, your honor, my name is McGinnis, Patrick McGinnis." And the judge said, "Mr. McGinnis, what is your occupation?"
And the little Irish feller said, "Judge, your honor, I am a sailor." The judge said, "Mr. McGinnis, you don't look to me as though you ever saw a ship in all your life." And the little Irish feller said, "Well, Judge, your honor, if I never saw a ship in me life, do you think I come over from Ireland in a wagon?" The judge said, "Case dismissed. Bring in the next prisoner." Well, the next prisoner what they brought in had sort of an impediment in his talk, and the way he stuttered just beat all. The judge said, "Prisoner, what is your name?" And the prisoner said, "Judge, your honor, my name is." The judge said, "Never mind, that'll do. Officer, what is this prisoner charged with?" And the officer said, "Judge, your honor, the way he talks sounds to me like he might be charged with soda water." Gosh, I got to laughing, so I had to get right out of the courthouse. It sort of made me think of a lawsuit we had down home when Jim Lawson was justice of the peace. You see, it was like this. One spring, Si Pettingill was going out to Missouri to be gone about a year, and he had sold off about all his things except one cow, and he didn't want to part with the cow 'cause she was a mighty good milker. So he struck a bargain with Lige Willett. Lige was to keep the cow, pasture and feed her, and generally take care on her for the milk she give. Well, finally Si come home, and he went to Lige's place one day and said, "Well, Lige, I've come over to get my cow." And Lige said, "Come after your cow? Well, if you've got any cow around here, I'll be derned if I know it." Si said, "Well, Lige, I left my cow with you." And Lige said, "Well, that's a year ago, and she's had her head off 2 or 3 times since then." So Si said, "Well, Lige, you've had her milk for her keep." And Lige said, "Milk be derned, she went dry 3 weeks after you left, and she ain't give any milk since. And near as I can figure it out, seems to me as how I've pastured her and fed her all this time, and she's my cow." Si said, "No, Lige, that weren't the bargain." But Lige said, "Bargain or no bargain, I've got her, and seeing as how possession is about 9 points in the law, I'm going to keep her." So they went to law about it. All Punkin Center turned out to hear the trial. Well, after Jim Lawson had heard both sides of the case, he said, "The court is compelled, from the evidence sought forth in this case, to find for the plaintiff, the aforesaid Silas Pettingill, as again the defendant, the aforesaid Elijah Willett. We find from the evidence sought forth that the cow critter in question is a valuable critter, and worth more than a year's pasture and keep, and therefore it is the verdict of this court that the aforesaid defendant, Elijah Willett, shall keep the cow 2 weeks longer, and then she is his'n." End of Uncle Josh in Police Court. Section 15 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh at Coney Island. I'd hear tell a whole lot at various times about that place what they call Coney Island, and while I was down in New York, I just made up my mind I was going to see it. So one day I got on one of them cars what goes across the Brooklyn Bridge, and I started out for Coney Island. Sitting right alongside of me in the car was an old lady. She seemed sort of fidgety about something or other, and finally she said to me, "Mister, do these cars stop when we get on the other side of the bridge?" I said, "Well, now, if they don't, you'll get the derndest bump you ever got in your life." Well, we got on the other side, and I got on one of them trolley cars that goes down to Coney Island. I gave the feller $1, and he put it in his pocket just the same as if it belonged to him. Well, when I was getting pretty near there, I said, "Mister, don't I get any change?" He said, "Didn't you see the sign on the car?" I said, "No, sir." Well, he says, "You better go and look at it." Well, I went out and looked at it, and that settled it. It said, "This car goes to Coney Island without change." Guess it did. I'll be darned if I got any. Well, we went down there, and I must say of all the pandemonium and hubbub I ever heard in my life, Coney Island beats it all. 'Bout the first thing I seen there was a place what they call Shoot the Chutes. It looked like a big horse trough stood on end, one end in a duck pond and t'other end up in the air, and they would haul a boat up to the top and all get in and then come scooting down the horse trough into the pond. Well, I 'lowed that'd be right smart fun, so I got into one of the boats along with a lot of other folks I never seed before and don't care if I never see again. They yanked us up to the top of that trough and then turned us loose, and I just felt as though the whole earth had run off and left us. We went down that trough lickety-split, and a woman what was setting alongside of me got scared and grabbed me round the neck, and I said, "You let go of me, you brazen female critter." But she just hung on and hollered to beat thunder, and everybody was yelling all at once, and that darn boat was a-going faster'n greased lightning, and I had one hand on my pocketbook and t'other on my hat, and we went kerslap-dab into that duck pond, and the darn boat upsot, and we went into the water. And that darn female critter hung on to me and hollered, "Save me, I'm just a-drowning." Well, the water wasn't very deep, and I just started to wade out when along come another boat and run over us, and under we went kersouse. Well, I managed to get out to the bank, and that female woman said I was a base villain to not rescue a lady from a watery grave. I just told her if she had kept her mouth shut, she wouldn't have swallowed so much of the pond. Well, they had one place what they call the Middleway Pleasance, and another place what they call the Streets of Cairo, and they had a lot of shows a-going on along there. Well, I went into one of 'em and sot down, and I guess if they hadn't shut up the show, I'd have been sotting there yet. I purty near busted my buttons laughing. They had a lot of gals a-dancing some kind of a dance. I don't know what they called it, but it suited me first rate. When I got home, the more I thought about it, the more I made up my mind I'd learn that dance. Well, I went out in the cornfield where none of the neighbors could see me, and I'll be darned if I didn't knock down about 4 acres of corn, but I never got that dance right. I was the talk of the whole community. Mother didn't speak to me for about a week, and Aunt Nancy Smith said I was a burning shame and a disgrace to the village. But I notice Nancy has asked me a good many questions about just how it was, and I wouldn't wonder if we didn't find Nancy out in the cornfield one of these days.
End of Uncle Josh at Coney Island. Section 16 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh at the Opera.
Well, I said to Mother when I left home, "Now, Mother, when I get down to New York City, I'm going to see a regular first-class theater. We never had many theater doings down our way. Well, there was a theater troupe come to Punkin Center along last summer, but we couldn't let 'em have the Opry House to show in 'cause it was summertime and the Opry House was full of hay, and we couldn't let 'em have it 'cause we hadn't any place to put the hay. And then about a year and a half ago there was a troupe come along that was something about Uncle Tom's Home. They left a good many of their things behind 'em when they went away. Ezra Hoskins, he got one of the mules, and he tried to hitch it up one day. Doctor says he thinks Ezra will be back around in about 6 weeks. I traded one of the dogs to Reuben Hendricks for a shotgun. Rube come over t'other day, borrowed the gun, and shot the dog. Well, I got into one of your theaters here, got sot down, and was looking at it, and it was a mighty fine-looking picture with lots of lights shining on it, and I was enjoying it first rate, when a lot of fellers come out with horns and fiddles, and they all started into fiddling and tooting, and all at once they pulled the theater up, and there was a lot of folks having a regular family quarrel. I knowed that wasn't any of my business, and I sort of felt uneasy like. but none of the rest of the folks seemed to mind it any, so I calculated I'd see how it come out, though my hands sort of itched to get hold of one feller, 'cause I could see if he would just go away and tend to his own business, there wouldn't be any quarrel. Well, just then a young feller handed me a piece of paper what told all about the theater doin's, and I got to looking at that, and I noticed on it where it said there was 5 years took place between the first part and the second part. Well, I knowed darn well I wouldn't have time to wait and see the second part, so I got up and went out. Well, them theater doin's just put me in mind of something what happened down home on the last day of school. You see, the school teacher got all the big boys and the big girls, and the boys they read essays, and the girls recited poetry. One of the Skinner girls recited a piece that suited me first rate. Near as I can remember, it went something like this. How nice to hear the bumblebee when you go out a-fishing, but if you happen to sot down on him, he'll spoil your disposition. I like that. There was something so touching about it. Then the school teacher, he got all the girls in the astronomy class, and he dressed them up to represent the different kinds of planets. He had one girl to represent the sun, she was red-headed, and another one to represent the moon, and another one for Mars, and another one for Jupiter, and it looked mighty fine, and everything was a-getting along first rate till old Jim Lawson allowed he could make an improvement on it. So he went out and got a colored girl, and he wanted to sot her between the sun and the moon and make an eclipse. And as usual, he busted up the whole doings. End of Uncle Josh at the Opera. Section 17 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh at Delmonico's. I used to hear the summer boarders tell a whole lot about a place here in New York kept by Mr. Delmonico. There's been about 10,000 summer boarders down to Punkin Center one time and another, and I guess I've carried the bundles and stood the grumbling from about all of them. And when any one of 'em would find fault with anything, I used to ask him where he boarded at in New York, and they all told me at Mr. Delmonico's. So I'd come to the conclusion that Mr. Delmonico must have a right smart, pretty good-sized tavern, and I said to Mother, "Now, Mother, when I get down to New York, that's where I'm going to board, at Mr. Delmonico's." Well, I got a feller to show me where it was, and when I got on the inside, I don't suppose I was ever more sot back in all my life. Guess you could have knocked my eyes off with a club, they stuck out like bumps on a log. Well, sir, they had flowers and birds everywhere, and trees a-setting in wash tubs. Didn't look to me as though they would stand much of a gale. And about 150 patent windmills running all to once, and out in the woods somewhere they had a band a-playin'. I couldn't see 'em, but I could hear 'em. Guess some of 'em was having a dance to settle down the dinner. I couldn't tell whether it was a society festival or a camp meeting at feeding time. Well, one feller come up to me and commenced talking some foreign language I didn't understand, something about bonsoir, monsieur. I just made up my mind he was one of them bunco fellers, and I wouldn't talk to him. Then another feller come up right smart like and wanted to know if I'd have my dinner table to hotel or all over a card. And I told him if it was all the same to him, he could bring my dinner on a plate. Well, he handed me a program of the dinner, and I ate about halfway down it and drank a bottle of cider pop what he give me, and it got into my head, and I never felt so darn good in all my life. I got to singing, and I danced old Dan Tucker right there in the dining room, and I took a wrastle out of Mr. Monsieur, and just when I got to enjoying myself right good, they called in a lot of constables, and it cost me $16.45, and then they took me out riding in a little blue wagon with a bell on it. They kept ringing the bell every foot of the way to let folks know I was one of Mr. Delmonico's boarders.
End of Uncle Josh at Delmonico's. Section 18 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. It is fall. The days are getting shorter and the summer birds are leaving. The wind sighs in the treetops as though all nature was grieving. The leaves they drop in showers, there's a blue haze over all, and a feller is reminded that once again it's fall. It is a glorious season, the crops most gathered in, the wheat is in the granary and the oats are in the bin. A feller just feels splendid, right in harmony with all. The old cider mill a-hummin', gosh, I know it's fall. I hear the bobwhite whistling down by the watermill, while dressed in gorgeous colors is each valley, knoll, and hill. The cows, they are a-lowing as they slowly wander home, and the hives are just a-busting with the honey in the comb. Soon be time for husking parties or an apple-paring bee, and the signs of peace and plenty are just splendid for to see. The flowers, they are drooping, soon there won't be none at all. Old Jack Frost has nipped 'em, and by that I know it's fall. The muskrat has built himself a house down by the old mill pond. The squirrels are laying up their store from the chestnut trees beyond. While walking through the orchard, I can hear the ripe fruit fall. There's an air of quiet comfort that only comes with fall. The wind is cool and bracing, and it makes you feel first rate. And there's work to keep you going from early until late. So you feel like giving praises unto Him who doeth all. Nature heaps her blessings on you at this season, and it's fall. The nights are getting frosty and the fire feels pretty good. I like to see the flames creep up among the burning wood. Away across the hilltops I can hear the hoot owl call. He is looking for his supper. I guess he knows it's fall. And though the year is getting old and the trees will soon be bare, there's a satisfactory feeling of enough and some to spare. For there's still some poor and needy who for our help do call. So we'll share with them our blessings and be thankful that it's fall. End of It Is Fall. Section 19 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Cy Pettingill's Brooms. Well, one day, just shortly after sap season was over, we was all sitting round Ezra Hoskins' store talking on things in general, when up drove Cy Pettingill with a load of brooms. Well, we all took a long breath and got ready to see some as tall bargaining as was ever done in Punkin Center, 'cause Cy, he could see a bargain through a 6-inch plank on a dark night, and Ezra could hear a dollar bill rattle in a bag of feathers a mile off, and we all felt mighty sartin something was a-going to happen. Well, Cy, he sort of stood around, didn't say much, and Ezra got most uncommonly busy. He had more business than a town marshal on Circus Day. Well, after he had sold Aunt Nancy Smith 3 yards of caliker and Reuben Hendricks a jackknife and swapped Jim Lawson a plug of tobacco for a muskrat hide, he said, "How's things over your way, Cy?" Cy remarked things was about as usual, only the water had been most uncommon high. White Fork had busted loose and overflowed everything. Sprosby's mill was washed out, and Lige Willett's pasture was all under water, which made it pretty hard on the cows. And Lige had to strain the milk 2 or 3 times to get the minners out of it. Whitaker's young uns was all having measles to once, and there was a revival going on at the Red Top Baptist Church, and most everyone had gotten religion, and things was a-running along 'bout as usual.
Deacon Witherspoon said, "Did you get religion, Si?" Si said, "No, Deacon, I got baptized, but it didn't take. Calculated I might as well have done it while there was plenty of water." "Thought I'd come over today, Ezra. I've got some brooms I'd like to sell you." Ezra said, "Bring 'em in, Si. Spring house cleaning is coming on, and I'll most likely need right smart of brooms, so just bring 'em in." Si said, "Well, Ezra, don't see as there's any need to crowd the mourners. Can't we dicker on it a bit? I want cash for these brooms, Ezra. I don't want any store trade for 'em." Ezra said, "Well, I don't know about that, Si. Seems to me that's a gray horse of another color. I always gin you store trade for your eggs, don't I?" Si said, "Yes, and that's a gray horse of another color. You never seen a hen lay brooms, did you? Brooms is sort of article of commerce, Ezra, and I want cash for 'em." Well, Ezra, he looked round the store and he thought for a spell, and then he said, "Tell you what I'll do, Si. I'll gin you half cash and the other half trade. How'll that be?" Si said, "Guess that'll be all right, Ezra. Where will I put the brooms?" Ezra said, "Put them in the back end of the store, Si, and stack 'em up good. I hadn't got much room, and I've got a lot of things coming in from Boston and New York." Well, after Si had the brooms all in, he said, "Well, there they be, 5 dozen on 'em." Ezra said, "Sure that's 5 dozen?" Si said, "Yes, counted 'em on the wagon, counted 'em off again, and counted 'em when I made 'em." So Ezra said, "Well, here's your money. Now what do you want in trade?" Si looked round for a spell and said, "I don't know, Ezra. Don't see anything any of our folks particularly stand in need on. If it's all the same to you, Ezra, I'll take brooms." Well, Jim Lawson fell off in a wash tub, and Reuben Hendricks cut his thumb with his new jackknife, and Deacon Witherspoon said, "No, Si, that baptizing didn't take." And Ezra, well, it weren't his say. Suspicion consists mainly of thinking what we would do if we was in the other feller's place. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Cy Pettingill's Brooms. Section 20 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh plays golf. "Well, about 2 weeks ago, the boys said to me, 'Uncle, we'd like to have you come out and play a game of golf.' Well, they took me out behind the woodshed where Mother couldn't see us, and them darn boys dressed your uncle up in the doggonedest suit of clothes I ever had on in my life. I had on a pair of socks that had more different colors in 'em than in Joseph's coat. I looked like a cross between a monkey and a circus rider, and a-going across the medder, our turkey gobbler took after me, and I had a awful time with that fool bird. I calculate as how I'll get even with him about Thanksgiving time. Well, the boys took me into the pasture, and they had it all dug up into what they called a T, and they had a wheelbarrow full of little Injun war clubs. They called one a nibbler and another a brassy, and a lot of other fool names I never heard afore and can't remember now. Then they brought out a little wooden ball about as big as a hen's egg, and they stuck it up on a little hunk of mud. Then they told me to take one of them there war clubs and stand alongside of the ball and hit it. Well, I just peeled off my coat, got a good holt on that war club, and I just whaled away at that darn little ball, and by gum, I missed it. And all the boys all commenced to holler, 'Foozle!' Well, I got a little bit riled, and I whaled away at it again, and I hit it right where I missed it the first time, and I whirled around and sot down so darn hard I sot 4 back teeth to aching, and I pawed around in the air and knocked a lot of it out of place. I hit myself on the shin and on the pet corn at the same time, and them darn boys was just a-rolling round on the ground and a-hollering like Injuns. Well, I begun to get madder'n a wet hen, and I 'lowed I'd knock that darn little ball way over into the next county. So I rolled up my sleeves and spit on my hands and got a good holt on that war club, and I whaled away at that little ball again, and by chowder I hit it. I knocked it clear over into Deacon Witherspoon's pasture and hit his old muley cow, and she got scared and run away, jumped the fence and went down the road, and the darn fool never stopped a running till she went slap dab into Ezra Hoskins' grocery store. She upset 4 gallons of apple butter into a keg of soft soap, and sot one foot into a tub of mackerel, and t'other foot into a box of winder glass, and knocked over Jim Lawson, who was a-sotting on a cracker barrel, and broke his derned old wooden leg. And then she went right out through the winder and scared Si Pettingill's horses that was a-standing there, and they run away and smashed his wagon into kindling wood, and Silas has sued me for damages, and Mother won't speak to me, and Jim he wants me to buy him a new wooden leg, and all the neighbors say as how I ought to be put away someplace for safe keeping. Aunt Nancy Smith got so excited she lost her glass eye and didn't find it for 3 or 4 days. And when she did get it back, the boys was a-playing marbles with it, and it was all full of gaps. And Jim Lawson, he trimmed it up on the grindstone, and it don't fit Nancy any more, and she has to sort of put it in with cotton round it to mold it, and the cotton works out at the corners and scares the children every time I see Nancy. That darned eye seems to look at me sort of reproachful like, and all I know about playing golf is this: the feller what knocks the ball so darn far you can't find it, or where it does the most damage, wins the game.
End of Uncle Josh Plays Golf. Section 21 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Jim Lawson's Hogs. When it come to raising hogs, I don't s'pose there was ever anybody in Punkin Center that had quite so much trouble as Jim Lawson. One fall Jim had a right likely bunch of shoats, but they somehow or other he couldn't get 'em fat. It just seemed like the more he fed 'em, the poorer they got, and Jim he was just worried clear down to a shadder. He kept giving them hogs medicine and feeding of 'em everything he could think on, but it warn't no use. Every day or so one of 'em would lay down and die. All the neighbors would come and lean over the fence and talk to Jim and give him advice, but somehow them hogs just kept on a-dying, and nobody could see what was ailing of 'em. Then one day Jim come over to Ezra Hoskins' store, and he looked as tickled as though he had found $1. And he said, "I want you all to come over to my place. I've found out what's ailing them hogs." Deacon Witherspoon said, "Well, what is it, Jim?" And Jim said, "Well, you see, the ground over in my hog lot is pretty soft, and when it rains it gets right smart muddy, and the mud gets on the hogs' tails, and that mud it gets more mud, and finally they get so much mud on their tails that it draws their skin so tight that they can't shut their eyes, and them hogs are just a-dying for the want of sleep." Well, the following winter Jim had his hogs all fat and ready for market, and he just concluded he'd drive 'em to Concord. Well, he started out, and when he had drove 'em 2 whole days, he met old Jabez Whittaker. Jabe said, "Where you going with your hogs, Jim?" Jim said, "Going to Concord, Jabez." Jabez said, "Well, now I want to know. That's what comes from not reading the papers. Why, Jim, they've got more hogs up Concord way than they know what to do with. Lige Willett took his hogs up there, and Eben Sprosby took his'n, and Concord's just chuck full of hogs, and so consequently the market is away down in Concord. But the paper says it's good in Manchester, and you'd make money, Jim, by going there." So Jim shifted his chew of tobacco over to the northeast and said, "Well, boys, I calculate we'll have to go to Manchester, so just head the hogs off and turn 'em round."
Well, they druv them hogs about 3 days towards Manchester, and just about when they was getting there, along come Caleb Skinner, and he said, "Wal, thunder and fish hooks, where be you a-goin', Jim?" And Jim said, as near as he could figure it out from his present bearings, he was most likely going to Manchester. And Caleb said, "What fer?" Jim said, "Don't know exactly what all he was going fer, but if he ever got there, he'd most likely sell his hogs." And Caleb said, "Well, you're going to the wrong town. Manchester has got a quarantine against any more hogs coming in, 'cause what hogs they is there has all got cholera, and you better go to Concord. Besides, the paper says market is pretty well up in Concord." Well, Jim said a good many things that wouldn't sound good at a prayer meeting, and then he said, "Well, boys, guess we'll start back for Concord, so turn around." Well, they went along about 2 days, and them poor hogs couldn't stand it no longer, 'cause they was just clean tuckered out. So Jim had to sell 'em to Josiah Martin for what he could get, 'cause it was just right at Josiah's place where the hogs get out, and there weren't no way of moving 'em from there for some time to come. Well, along about 2 weeks after that, we was all over to Ezra Hoskins' store, and someone said, "Jim, you didn't do very well with your hogs this year, did you?" And Jim said, "Oh, I don't know. That's just owing to how you look at it. I never caught up to that blame market, but I had the society of the hogs for 2 weeks." End of Jim Lawson's Hogs. Section 22 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh and the Lightning Rod Agent. Well, I suppose I get buncoed oftener than any feller what ever lived in Punkin Center. A short time ago we wanted to build a new town hall and calculated we'd have a brick building. And someone said, "Well, now if you'll just wait till Josh Weathersby makes another trip or two down to New York, there'll be gold bricks enough a-layin' around Punkin Center to build a new town hall." Well, one day last summer I was a-sottin' out on my back porch when along come one of them there lightning rod agents. Well, he just come right up and commenced to talking at me just as if he'd been the town marshal or a tax assessor, or like he'd known me all his life. He said, "My dear sir, I am astonished at you. I've looked over your entire premises, and I find you haven't got a lightning rod on any building that you possess. Why, my dear sir, don't you know you are flying right in the face of Providence? Don't you know that lightning may strike at any time and demolish everything within the sound of my voice? Don't you know that you are criminally negligent? Why, my dear sir, I am astonished to think that a man of your judgment and good common sense should allow yourself to—" Well, about that time I got my breath and my wits at the same time, and I said, "Now hold on, gosh darn you, what have you got to sell anyhow?" Well, he told me he had some lightning rods, and he brought out a little machine and told me to take hold of the handles, and he'd show me what a powerful thing electricity was. Well, I took hold of them handles, and he turned on a crank, and that darn machine just made me dance all over the porch, and it wouldn't let go. Gee whiz, I felt as though I'd fell in a yeller jacket's nest, and about 4,000 of 'em was a-stinging me all to onct. Well, I told him I guessed he could put up a lightning rod or two, seein's how I didn't have any. Well, he went to work, and I went over to Ezra Hoskins, and when I got back home, my place was a sight to behold. It looked like a harrow turned upside down. There was 7 lightning rods on the barn, 1 on the hen house, 1 on the corn crib, 1 on the smokehouse, 2 on the granary, 3 on the kitchen, 6 on my house, and 1 on the crab apple tree. And when I got there, that darn fool had the old muley cow cornered up and trying to put a lightning rod on her. Well, I paid him for what he had done, and I thanked the Lord he hadn't done any more. Well, he got me to sign a paper what said he had done a good job, and he said he had to show that to the company. Well, about a week after that, we had a thunderstorm, and I think the lightning struck everything on the place except the spring wagon and the old muley cow, and they didn't have any lightning rod on them. Well, I thought I was a-getting off mighty lucky till next day, when along come a feller with that paper what I had signed, and derned if it weren't a note for $600, and by gosh, if I didn't have to pay it. Buncoed again by chowder. Energy. There's a lot of energy in this life that is wasted. I notice that the man who has a good strong pipe most usually rides in front. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Uncle Josh and the Lightning Rod Agent. Section 23 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. A Meeting of the Annanias Club. Well, sometimes a lot of us old codgers used to get down to Ezra Hoskins' grocery store, and we'd sot around and chaw tobacco and whittle sticks and eat crackers and cheese and prunes and anything Ezra happened to have lying around loose, and then we'd get to spinning yarns that would just about put Annanias and Sapphire right out of business if they was here now. Well, one afternoon we was all setting round spinning yarns when Deacon Witherspoon said that echoes was mighty peculiar things, 'cause down where he was born and raised there was a passel of hills come together, and you couldn't get out there and talk louder'n a whisper on account of the echo. But one day a summer boarder what was there remarked as how he wasn't afraid to talk right out in meeting in front of any old lot of hills what was ever created. So he went out and hollered just as loud as he could holler, and he started a echo a-going, and it flew up agin one hill and bounced off onto another one, and getting bigger and louder all the time till it got back where it started from and hit a stone quarry and knocked off a piece of stone and hit that feller in the head, and he didn't come to for over 3 hours. Well, we thought that was pretty good for a deacon. Well, none of us said anything for a right smart spell, and then Cy Pettingill remarked he didn't know anything about echoes, but he calculated he'd seen some mighty peculiar things. Said he guessed he had seen it rain about as hard as anybody ever seen it rain. Someone said, "Well, Cy, how hard did you ever see it rain?" And he said, "Well, one day last summer down our way it got to rainin', and it rained so hard that the drops just rubbed together comin' down, which made them so all fired hot that they turned to steam. Why, it rained so gosh danged hard there was a cider barrel layin' out in the yard that had both heads out'n it and the bunghole up. Well, it rained so hard into that bunghole that the water couldn't run out of both ends of the barrel fast enough, and it swelled up and busted." Well, we all took a fresh char tobacco and nudged each other, and Ezra Hoskins said he didn't remember as how he had ever seen it rain quite so hard as that, but he had seen some mighty dry weather. He said one time when he was out in Kansas, it got so tarnation dry that fish a-swimming up the river left a cloud of dust behind 'em. And hot, why it got so all fired hot that one day he tied his mule to a pen of popcorn out behind the barn, and it got so hot that the corn got to popping and flying around that old mule's ears, and he thought it was snow and laid down and froze to death. Well, about that time, old Jim Lawson commenced to show signs of uneasiness, and someone said, "What is it, Jim?" And Jim remarked as he shifted his tobacco and cut a sliver off his wooden leg, "I was a-thinking about a cold spell we had one winter when we was a-living down Nantucket way. It was hog killing time, if I remember right. Anyhow, we had a kettle of boiling water sotting on the fire, and we sot it outdoors to cool off a little, and that water froze so darn quick that the ice was hot. Ezra said, "Guess it's about shutting up time." End of A Meeting of the Annanias Club.
Section 24 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Jim Lawson's Hoss Trade.
Speaking of hoss trading, now Jim Lawson was calculated to be about the best hoss trader in Punkin Center. Yes, Jim, he could sot up on a fence, chew tobacco, whittle a stick, and just about swap you out in your eye teeth if you'd listen to him. Yes, Jim was some punkins on a swap. Jim would swap anything he had for anything he didn't want, just to be swapping. Well, a gypsy come along one day and tackled Jim for a swap, and about that time Jim he got hold of a critter that had more cussedness in him to the square inch than any critter we'd ever sot eyes on, 'cept a circus mule that Ezra Hoskins owned. Well, the gypsy traded Jim a mighty fine-looking critter, and we all calculated that Jim had right smart of a bargain, till one day Jim went to ride him, and he found out if he fetched the pesky critter on the sides, he'd squat right down. Well, Jim knowed if he didn't get rid of that hoss, his reputation as a hoss trader was gone forever, so he went over into the township to see old Deacon Witherspoon. You see, the deacon, he was mighty fond of going hunting, and as he had rheumatiz pretty bad, it was sort of hard for him to get around, so he had to do his hunting on hossback. Well, Jim didn't say much to fuss, just kinder hinted around that hunting was going to be mighty good this fall, 'cause he'd seen one or two flocks of partridges over back of Sprosby's medder, and some right smart of quail over by Buttermilk Ford, and finally he said, "Deacon, I've got a hoss you ought to have. He's a setter." Well, you could have knocked the deacon's eyes off with a club. They stuck out like bumps on a log. And he said, "Why, Jim, I never heard tell of such a thing in all my life. The idea of a horse being a setter." Jim said, "Yes, Deacon, he's been trained to set for all kinds of game. I calculated as how I'd get a shotgun this fall and do right smart a hunting." So the deacon said, "Well, now, I want to know. Bring him over, Jim. I'd like to see him." Well, Jim took the hoss over, and all of Punkin Center just sort of held its breath to see how it would come out. Jim and the deacon went a-hunting, and as they was a-riding along through the timber down by Reuben Hendrick's pasture, Jim keeping his eyes peeled and not saying much, when all to once he seen a rabbit setting in a brush heap, and he just touched the old horse on the side, and he squatted right down. The deacon said, "Why, what's the matter of your hoss, Jim? Look what he be a-doing." Jim said, "Shush, Deacon, don't you see that rabbit over there in the brush heap? The old hoss is a-setting of him." Deacon said, "Well, now, that's the most remarkable thing I ever seen in my life. How'd you like to trade, Jim?" Jim said, "Well, Deacon, I hadn't calculated on disposing of the hoss, but I ain't much of a hand at hunting, and seeing as how it's you, if you want him, I'll trade you, Deacon, $50 to boot." Well, the deacon had a mighty fine animal, but he said, "I'll trade you, Jim." They traded hosses, and when they was a-comin' home, they had to ford the crick what runs back of Punkin Center. The old hoss was a-wading through the water, and the deacon went to pull his feet up to keep 'em from getting wet, and he touched the old hoss on the sides, and the hoss squatted right down in the crick. Deacon said, "Now looky here, Jim, what's the matter with this ungodly brute? He ain't a-setting now, be he?" Jim said, "Yes, he is, Deacon. He sees fish in the water. Tell you, he's trying to set for suckers same as for rabbits. Oh, Deacon, he's had a thorough education."
Paradox. I can't exactly describe it, but it looks to me like a tramp who once told me how to be successful in life. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Jim Lawson's Hoss Trade. Section 25 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. A meeting of the school directors. We had been having a good deal of argufying about the schoolhouse. You see, it had got to be a sort of a tumble-down, ramshackle sort of affair, and when it was bad weather, we couldn't have school in it, 'cause you might just as well be a-sitting under a sieve when it rained as to be a-sitting in that schoolhouse. Well, it was coming along the fall term, and we wanted our boys and girls to get all the schooling and education what they could. So we called a meeting of the school directors to devise ways and means of building a new schoolhouse without stopping school. Well, we all met down at the schoolhouse. There was Deacon Witherspoon, Ezra Hoskins, Reuben Hendricks, Cy Pettingill, old Jim Lawson, and me. Before we commenced debating and argufying on the matter, Cy Pettingill allowed he'd sing a song. Well, he got up and sang the derndest old-fashioned song I calculate I ever heard in my life. Went something like this. Oh, a frog went a-courtin' and he did ride, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. Oh, a frog went a-courtin' and he did ride with a sword and pistol by his side, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. He rode till he came to the mouse's door, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. He rode till he came to the mouse's door, and there he knelt upon the floor, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. He took Miss Mousie on his knee, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. He took Miss Mousie on his knee, said he, Missy Mouse, will you marry me, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. Well, we headed Si off right there. I guess if we hadn't, he'd been singing about that frog and the mouse till yet. Well, just then old Jim Lawson, he said, I make a motion. And Deacon Witherspoon, he was chairman, and he said, now look here, young feller, don't you make any motions at me, or derned if I don't get down there and flop you in about a minute. You take your feet off'n that desk and that corncob pipe out in your mouth and conduct yourself with dignity and decorum, and address the chairman of this year meeting in a manner befitting to his station. Well, Jim, he got right smart riled over the matter, and he said, well, you gosh derned old gospel pirate, I want you to understand that I'm a member of this body, a citizen, a taxpayer, and an honorably discharged servant of the government, and I make a motion that we build a new schoolhouse out of the bricks of the old schoolhouse, and I do further offer an amendment to the original motion that we don't tear down the old schoolhouse until the new one is built. Well, Deacon Witherspoon said, the gentleman is out of order. And Jim said, I ain't so darn much out of order but that I can trim you in about 2 shakes of a dead sheep's tail. Well, before we knowed it, them 2 old cusses was at it. The deacon, he grabbed Jim, and Jim, he grabbed the deacon, and when we got 'em separated, the deacon, he was stuck fast between the desk and the wood box, and Jim had his wooden leg through a knothole in the floor and couldn't get it out, and they've both gone to law about it. Jim says he's going to get out a writ of Corpus Christi for the deacon, and the deacon says he's going to prosecute Jim for bigamy and arson and have him read out of the church. Well, we've got the same old schoolhouse. Justice. Those who hanker for it would be generally better off if they didn't get it. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of A Meeting of the School Directors. Section 26 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. The weekly paper at Punkin Center. Well, t'other day down in New York, I was a-walking along on that street what they call the Broadway when I come to the Herald Square newspaper building, and it was all winders and machinery. Well, I was just flabgasted. I just stood there looking at it. On the front there was a bell and a couple of fellers standing alongside of it with sledgehammers in their hands, and every once in a while they would go to pounding on that bell, and folks would stand around and watch 'em do it. They reminded me of a couple of fellers splitting rails.
and all around the edge of the building they had hoot owls sotting with electric lights in their eyes, and there was no end to the machinery in that building. If anyone had ever told me that there was that much machinery in the whole world, derned if I'd have believed them. Biggest machine I'd ever seen before was Si Pettingill's new thrashing machine. Well, I just stood there watching them printing presses a-running paper going into one end and coming out at the other, all printed and full of pictures and folded up ready to sell. It just beat all the way they done it. Well, we never had but one paper down home at Punkin Center. We called it the Punkin Center Weekly Bugle. Old Jim Lawson, he was editor of it. You see, Jim, he was sort of a trifling, no-count old cuss, so to keep him out of mischief, we made him editor. Well, Jim, he had his place up over Ezra Hoskins' grocery store. He never got any money for the newspaper, always got paid in produce, and Ezra's store was a mighty good place for him to take in his subscriptions. Well, things went along pretty smooth for quite a spell, till one day a feller he come in and give Jim a keg of hard cider for a year's subscription to the newspaper. We all calculated right then that something was a-going to happen, and sure enough it did. You see, about that time Jim had got two advertisements. One was for Reuben Jackson's restaurant, and the other was the timetable of the Punkin Center and Paw Paw Valley Railroad. Well, Jim, he got to drinking the hard cider and setting type at the same time, and when the paper come out on Thursday, it was worth going miles to see. Near as I can remember, it said that Reuben Jackson's restaurant would leave the depot every morning at 8 o'clock for beefsteak and mutton stews, and would change cars at White River Junction for mince and pumpkin pies and cottage pudding. There would be a flag station for coffee and doughnuts like Mother used to make, and the train wouldn't run on Sundays 'cause the station agent what done the cooking would have to run an extra on that day over the chicken and ham sandwich division. I believe that was the last issue of the Punkin Center Weekly Bugle. Enthusiasm, sometimes inspired, sometimes acquired, sometimes the result of immediate surroundings, and sometimes the result of hard cider. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of The Weekly Paper at Punkin Center. Section 27 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh at a camp meeting. Well, we just been having a camp meeting at Punkin Center. Yes, for several days we was pretty busy baking and cooking and making preparations for the camp meeting, and some of the committee allowed we ought to have lemonade for the Sunday school children. Well, as we wanted to get it just as cheap as possible, we dammed up the creek what runs back of the camp meeting grounds and put in 10 pounds of brown sugar and half a dozen lemons and let the Sunday school children drink right out of the creek free of charge. Well, we had right smart difficulty in getting a pulpit fixed up for the ministers, but finally we sawed down a hemlock tree and used the stump for a pulpit. Well, some of the sermons preached at that camp meeting beat anything I ever heard in my life afore. You see, we'd been having a good many arguments about corporations, monopolies, and trusts, and one minister got up and said, "Ah, my dear beloved brethren and sisters, we should not be too severe on the monopolists. If we read the scriptures closely, we observe our forefathers was all monopolists. Adam and Eve had a monopoly upon the Garden of Eden, and would have had it till this day, no doubt, had not Mother Eve got squeezed in the apple market. Yea, verily, Lot's wife had a corner on the salt market. And while Pharaoh's daughter was not in the milk business, yet we observe she took a great profit out of the water. Yea, verily. Most on us come to the conclusion he was riding on a free pass." Samantha Hoskins concluded she would have to sing her favorite hymn. It went something like this. Oh, you need not come in the morning, and neither in the heat of the day, but come along in the evening, Lord, and wash my sins away. Standing on the walls of Zion, looking at my ship come sailing o'er. Standing on the walls of Zion, to see my ship come in. Just about that time, Reuben Hendricks scared a skunk out of a holler log. Si Pettingill stirred up a hornet's nest. Deacon Witherspoon sat down in a huckleberry pie, and Aunt Nancy Smith got a spider on her, and she started into yelling and jumping like she had a fit, and two dogs got to fighting. Old Jim Lawson, he tried to get the dogs apart, and he stumped around and got his old wooden leg into a post hole and fell down, and the dogs got on top of him, and you couldn't tell which was Jim or which was dog, and derned if it didn't bust up the camp meeting. End of Uncle Josh at a Camp Meeting. Section 28 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. The Unveiling of the Organ. It was down in Punkin Center, I believe, in '89. We had some doings at the meeting house that we thought was pretty fine. It was a great occasion. The choir, led by Sister Morgan, had called us there to witness the unveiling of the organ. In order for to get it, we'd been saving here and there, looking forward to the time when we'd have music for to spare. And as the time it had arrived and the organ had come too, we had all of us assembled there to hear what the thing could do. Well, it was a gorgeous instrument, in a handsome walnut case, and there was expectation pictured out on every face. Then when Deacon Witherspoon had led us all in prayer, the congregation all stood up, and Old Hundred rent the air. Just then the doings took a turn, though I'm ashamed to say it. We found that old Jim Lawson was the only one could play it. But Jim, the poor old feller, had one besetting sin, a fondness for hard cider, which he'd been indulging in. But he sat down at that organ, planked his feet upon the pedals, and he showed us he could play it, though he hadn't any medals. He dwelt upon the treble, and he flirted with the bass. He almost made that organ jump right out of its case. Well, the cider got in old Jim's head and in his fingers too, so he played some dancing music, and old Yankee Doodle Doo. He shocked old Deacon Witherspoon and scared poor Sister Morgan, and just busted up the meeting at the unveiling of the organ. End of The Unveiling of the Organ. Section 29 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh plays a game of baseball. I had heard a whole lot about them games of football they have in New York, so while I was there, I just come to the conclusion I'd see a game of it. So I went out to one of their city pastures to see a game of football. Well, now, I must say, I didn't see much ball playing of any kind. All I got to see was about 50 or 60 ambulances, and I think about that many surgeons and physicians. Well, from what I could see of the game, I calculate they needed all of them. I saw one feller and about 50 others had him down, and it looked as though they was trying to all get a kick at him. They had a halfback and a quarterback. I suppose when they got through with that feller, he was a humpback. Anyhow, if that's what they call football playing, your Uncle Josh don't want any football in his'n. I never played but one game of ball in my life that I can remember on, and I don't believe that I ever will forget it. You see, it was along in the springtime of the year, and the weather was pretty warm and sunshiny, and the boys said to me, "Uncle, we'd like to have you help us play a game of baseball." I said, boys, I'm getting a little too old for those kind of pastimes, but I'll help you play one game. I'll be darned if I don't. Well, we got out in the pasture and was getting ready to play. We got the bases and bats put around in their places and a bucket of drinking water up in the fence corner where we could get a drink when we wanted it. We didn't have any bleachers, but we had 30 or 40 hogs, and they was the best rooters you ever seen. Just then I happened to look around, and there was the biggest billy goat I ever saw in my life. You ought to seen the boys a-getting out of the pasture. I would have got out too, but I got stuck in the fence. Well, you ought to have seen that billy goat a-getting me through the fence. He didn't get me all the way through, 'cause I was halfway through when he got there, but he got the last half through. I didn't make any home run, but I was the only feller what had a score of the game. I couldn't see the score, but I had it. Every time I'd go to sot down, I know just exactly how the game stood. They have a good many newfangled games now, but when they get anything that can beat a game of baseball with a billy goat for a battery, darned if I don't want to see it.
End of Uncle Josh Plays a Game of Baseball. Section 30 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. The Punkin Center and Pawpaw Valley Railroad. Wonders will never cease. We've got a railroad in Punkin Center now. Oh, we're getting to be right smart cityfied. I guess that's about the crookedest railroad that was ever built. I think that railroad runs across itself in one or two places. It runs past one station 3 times. It's so darn crooked they have to burn crooked wood in the engine. Well, the first engine they had on the Punkin Center was a wonderful piece of machinery. It had a 5-foot boiler and a 7-foot whistle, and every time they blowed the whistle, the darned old engine would stop. Well, we've got the railroad, and we're mighty proud of it. But we had an awful time of getting it through. You see, most everybody gave the right-of-way except Ezra Hoskins, and he didn't like to see it go through his medder field, and it seemed as though they'd have to go around for quite a ways, and maybe they wouldn't come to Punkin Center at all. Well, one morning Ezra saw a lot of fellers down in the medder most uncommonly busy like, so he went down to them, and he said, "What be you a-doing down here?" And they said, "Well, Mr. Hoskins, we're surveying for the railroad." And Ezra said, "So, we're going to have a railroad, be we? Is it going right through here?" And they said, "Yes, Mr. Hoskins, that's where it's a-going, right through here." Ezra said, "Well, I suppose you'll have a right smart of plowing and digging, and you'll just about plow up my medder field, won't you?" They said, "Yes, Mr. Hoskins, we'll have to do some grading." Ezra said, "Well, now, let me see. Is it a-going just the way you've got that instrument pinted?" They said, "Yes, sir, just there." And Ezra said, "Well, near as I can calculate from that, I should judge it was a-going right through my barn." They said, "Yes, Mr. Hoskins, we're sorry, but the railroad is a-going right through your barn." Well, Ezra didn't say much for quite a spell, and we all expected there would be trouble. But finally he said, "Well, I suppose the community of Punkin Center needs a railroad, and I hadn't ought to offer any objections to its going through. But I'm going to tell you one thing right now, afore you go any further. When you get it built and a-running, you've got to get a man to come down here and take care on it, 'cause it's a-coming along haying and harvesting time, and I'll be too darn busy to run down here and open and shut them barn doors every time one of your pesky old trains wants to go through." Love, an indescribable longing, something that existed since Mother Eve was in the apple trust, and will exist until the end of time. Something that no man has ever yet defined or ever will define. A something that is past all description, which will make a hired man forget to do the chores, and will make an old man act boyish, and will make a woman show herself to be stronger than the strongest man. Gosh darn it, an indescribable something that has never yet been described. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of The Punkin Center and Pawpaw Valley Railroad. Section 31 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh on a Bicycle. Along last summer, Reuben Hoskins, that is Ezra Hoskins' boy, he come home from college and brought one of them newfangled bicycle machines home with him. And I think ever since that time the whole town of Punkin Center has got the bicycle fever. Old Deacon Witherspoon, he's been a-riding a bicycle to Sunday school, and Jim Lawson, he couldn't ride one of 'em because he's got a wooden leg, but he just calculated if he could get it hitched up to the mowing machine, he could cut more hay with it than any man in Punkin Center. Somebody said Cy Pettingill was trying to pick apples with a bicycle. Well, all our boys and girls are riding bicycles now. Nothing would do, but I must learn how to ride one of them. Well, I didn't think very favorably on it, but in order to keep the peace in the family, I told him I would learn. Well, gee whillicky by gum, I wish you had been there when I commenced. I took that machine by the horns and I let it out into the middle of the road, and I got on it sort of unconcerned like, and then I got off sort of unconcerned like. Well, I sot down a minute to think it over, and then the trouble commenced. I got on that darn machine, and it jumped up in the front, and kicked up behind, and bucked up in the middle, and shied, and balked, and jumped sideways, and carried on worse'n a couple of steers the first time they was yoked. Well, I managed to hang on for a spell, and then I went up in the air, and come down all over that bicycle. I fell on top of it, and under it, and on both sides of it. I fell in front of the front wheel and behind the hind wheel at the same time. Derned if I know how I done it, but I did. I run my foot through the spokes and put 150 punctures in a hedge fence and scared a horse and buggy clear off the highway. I done more different kinds of tumbling than any circus performer I ever seen in my life, and I made more revolutions in a 15-foot circle than any buzzsaw that was ever invented. Well, I lost the lamp, I lost the clamp, I lost my patience, I lost my temper, I lost my self-respect, my last suspender button, and my standing in the community. I broke the handlebars, I broke the sprockets, I broke the 10 Commandments, I broke my New Year's pledge, and the law again loud and abusive language, and Jim Lawson got so excited he run his wooden leg through a knothole in the porch and couldn't get it out again. Well, I'm through with it. Once is enough for me. You can all ride your darn bicycles that want to, but for my part, I just as soon stand up and walk as to sit down and walk. No more bicycles for your Uncle Josh, not if he knows it, and your Uncle Josh sort of calculates as how he do. Notoriety. A next-door neighbor to glory, but another way of getting it. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Uncle Josh on a Bicycle. Section 32 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. A Baptizin at the Hickory Corners Church. Along about 2 summers ago, we had a baptizin at the Hickory Corners Church, and before the baptizin we had preachin', and before the preachin' we had Sunday school. Well, now, some of them questions and answers in that Sunday school just made me snicker right out loud. You see, old Deacon Witherspoon was a teachin' the Sunday school class, and he said, "Now, let me see what little boy can tell me who slew the Philistines and where at." Well, no one said anything for about a minute. Then a little red-headed feller down at the foot of the class said, "Commodore Dewey at Manila." The deacon said, "No, Henry, it wasn't Commodore Dewey what slew the Philistines. It was Samson." Another little feller said, "No, Deacon, I think you sort of got it mixed up. He wasn't there. Schley is the feller what done the job at Santiago." The deacon said, "Now, boys, you been reading too much about them war doings in the papers. Now, what little boy can tell me what is the first commandment?" And Ezra Hoskins' boy said,
Remember the Maine. Gosh, I had to go right out of the meeting house where I could have a good laugh. Well, I wouldn't have been down there in the first place, or the second place for that matter, if it hadn't have been for old Jim Lawson. You see, Jim, he's a peculiar old critter. He's got one eye out, lost it looking for a pension, I believe. Well, Jim, he come over to my house and he said, "Josh, let's you and me go down to the Baptizin." I said, "What do you want to go down there for, Jim? You can't get any pension there, can you?" Jim said, "Well, you see, Josh, there was a peddler left some hymn books at my house, and I want to go down there and see if I can't sell 'em." Well, he hadn't been more than a minute when Jim he told the minister he had the hymn books to sell, and the minister said he'd tell the congregation all about it. Then Jim he sot down in the meeting house and went to sleep, and then he went to snoring. You could hear him clear across a 40-acre lot. I wouldn't have cared a gosh darn, but he woke me up. Well, about the time the minister was getting through his sermon, he said, "Now all the members of the congregation having babies here today, and wanting of them baptized after the sermon is over, bring them up to the pulpit, and I will baptize them." Well, Jim, he woke up about that time, and he thought the minister was a-talking about his hymn books. So he stood up and said, "Now all you folks what ain't got any, I'll let you have 'em, 25 cents apiece." Religion. Any one man's opinion, but consists mainly of doing right. Pumpkin Center Philosophy. End of A Baptizin at the Hickory Corners Church. Section 33 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Reminiscence of My Railroad Days. Dedicated to Engineer John Houlihan, Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, John, I read your poetry and laughed till I nearly cried, seeing how you became an engineer and got on the right-hand side. It made me think of the days gone by when I was one of you fellers, too, what used to run an old machine and go tootin' the country through. But the engine that I had then, John, was far from a Nancy Hanks. She was old and worn and loggy and just chuck full of pranks. And she was wonderfully got up, John, full of bolts and valves and knobs, and the boiler wouldn't hold water, gosh, it wouldn't hold cobs. But I was younger then, John, and I didn't care a cuss, so I'd pull the throttle open and just let her wheeze and fuss. The road that I was a-running on was out in the woolly west, 2 streaks of rust, and the right-of-way was putting it at its best. So we sort of plugged along, John, and didn't put on any frills, never thought of doing anything but doubling all the hills. I tell you those were rocky times, and we hadn't no air brake, and 15 miles an hour, John, was dern good time to make. And there was as good a lot of boys as you could meet with anywhere, rough and ready, open up, and always on the square. And I'd like to see them all again and grasp each honest hand. But some of them, like me, have quit. Some have gone to another land. I have changed somewhat since then, John, just a little more steady growed. But I often think of my railroad days as the happiest ones I've knowed. And, John, I often watch the train as they go whizzing by. As I think of Bill or Jim or Jack, there's a tear comes in my eye. Perhaps you'd like to know, John, just why I quit the rail. And as some feller one time said, thereby hangs a tale. I was going along one night, John, at a pretty lively rate, the old machine a-doing her best, and me 40 minutes late. When all at once there came a crash. I felt the old track yield, and fireman, machine, and I went into a farmer's field. There's little more to say, John. They laid me up for repairs, but my fireman, poor fella, hadn't time to say his prayers. So now you have my story, John. Still, you don't know how it feels to know you've got to plug around on a couple of flat wheels. But it doesn't bother me, John. Gosh, not for a minute. I'm as happy as the day is long and feel just strictly in it. But sometimes I like to meet the boys and talk them days all over, and I feel as gay and chipper as a calf in a field of clover. But the happiest days I've known, John, the ones that to me seem best, was when I run a old machine way out in the woolly west. Glory, getting killed and not getting paid for it. Punkin Center Philosophy. End of Reminiscence of My Railroad Days. Section 34 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh at a Circus. Well, long last year, about harvest time, there was a circus come to Punkin Center, and I think the whole population turned out to see it. They come parading into town, the bands a-playin' and banners flyin' and animals poking their heads out of the cages and all sorts of gimcracks. Deacon Witherspoon said they was a sinful lot of men and women, and no one ought to go and see them. But seeing as how they was there, he allowed he'd take the children and let them see the lions and tigers and things. Si Pettingill remarked, "Guess the deacon won't put blinders on himself when he gets there." We noticed afterwards that the deacon had a front seat where he could see and hear pretty well. Well, I said to Ezra Hoskins, "Let you and me go down to the circus." And Ezra said, "All right, Joshua." So we got on our store clothes, our new boots, and put some money in our pockets and went down to the circus. Well, I never seen anyone in my life cut up more fool capers than Ezra did. We got in where the animals was, and Ezra he walked around the elephant 3 or 4 times, and then he said, "By gum, Josh, that's a dern handy critter. He's got 2 tails, and he's eating with one and keeping the flies off with t'other. Derned old fool." Well, we went on a little ways further, and all at once Ezra he said, "Gee whiz, Josh, there's Steve Jenkins over there in one of them cages." I said, "Come along, you silly fool, that ain't Steve Jenkins." Ezra said, "Well, now, guess I'd oughter know Steve Jenkins when I see him. I just about pretty near raised Steve." Well, we went over to the cage, and it warn't no man at all, nothing only a derned old baboon. And Ezra wanted to shake hands with him just 'cause he looked like Steve. Ezra said he'd bet a peck of pippins that baboon belonged to Steve's family a long ways back. Well, then we went into where they was having the circus doings, and I guess us 2 old codgers just about busted our buttons a-laughing at that silly old clown. Well, he cut up a lot of didos, then he went out and sot down right alongside of Aunt Nancy Smith, and Nancy she'd like to have had hysterics. She said, "You go away from me, you painted critter," and that clown he just up and yelled to beat thunder. Said Nancy stuck a pin in him. Well, everybody laughed, and Nancy she just sot and giggled right out. Well, they brought a trick mule into the ring, and the ringmaster said he'd give anyone $5 what could ride the mule. And Reuben Hoskins allowed he could ride anything with 4 legs what had hair on. So he got into the ring, and that mule he took after Reuben and chased him round that ring so fast Reuben could see himself going round t'other side of the ring. He was mighty glad to get out of there. Then a gal come out on horseback and commenced riding around. Nancy Smith said she was a brazen critter to come out there without clothes enough on her to dust a fiddle. But Deacon Witherspoon said that was the art of questionism, and we all allowed it, whatever he meant. And then that silly old clown he told the ringmaster that his uncle committed suicide different than any man whatever committed suicide. And the ringmaster said, "Well now, how did your uncle commit suicide?" And that silly old clown said, "Why, he put his nose in his ear and blowed his head off." Then he sang an old-fashioned song I hadn't heard in a long time. Went something like this. From Whittletown to Wattletown is 15 miles. From Wattletown to Whittletown is 15 miles. From Whittletown to Wattletown, from Wattletown to Whittletown. Take it all together and it's 15 miles. He was about the silliest cuss I ever seen. Well, I noticed a feller rummaging around among the benches as though he might have lost something. So I said to him, "Mister, did you lose anything round here any place?" He said, "Yes, sir, I lost a $10 bill. If you find it, I'll give you $2. Well, I just made up my mind he was one of them circus sharpers, and when he warn't looking, I pulled a $10 bill out of my pocket and gave it to him, and the darn fool didn't know but what it was the same one that he lost. Gosh, I just fooled him out of his $2 slicker'n a whistle. I tell you, Circus Day is a great time in Punkin Center."
End of Uncle Josh at a Circus. Section 35 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh invites the city folks to visit him.
"I didn't suppose when I was getting ready to go home that all you folks would be down here to the depot to see me off. Well, now that's pretty good of you. I'll be darned if it ain't. Yes, I guess I'll have to be going home now. I've stayed here this time about as long as I can afford to. I must say, some of you folks have made it pretty warm for me since I've been here in New York, but I guess I've enjoyed it about as much as you have. I'd like to have you all come down to Punkin Center and see me sometime this summer if you hadn't got nothing else to do. Lots of fun down there on that farm of mine, hunting, fishing, and shooting, and other things. Well, I never shot but one bird in my life, and that was a squirrel. Yes, sir, a flying squirrel. I had a feller working for me on the farm last summer, and he was cross-eyed, and I sent him out in the pasture to dig a well for me, and what do you suppose? Well, he dug it so tarnal all-fired crooked that he fell out of it and sprained his ankle. Then one day I sent him out in the garden to plant some potatoes and some onions for me, and it just seemed like that feller didn't have good hoss sense. He planted them onions and potatoes right alongside of each other, and the onions got into the potatoes' eyes and they couldn't see to grow. Oh, yes, lots of fun down home once in a while. I calculate I've got the funniest lot of chickens you ever heard tell on. I've got 60 old hens, and they lay an egg every day. But they don't lay any at night, 'cause when night comes, every one of them is roosters. I had one old hen, she went into the woodshed and sat down on the axe and tried to hatch it. I had another one sitting on a doorknob, trying to hatch out a house and lot, but she didn't. While she was a-sitting there, along come a rooster, and he said, "We're having a little party down behind the barn. Will you dance with me this set?" And she said, "No, sir, I'm engaged to his knobs for this set." Gosh, I was afraid to go out in the barnyard one while, 'cause one day when I was out there I heard a hen say to a rooster, "There's that old gray-headed cuss we've been a-layin' for." Oh, guess that's my train. S'pose I'll have to be going. Goodbye. Come down and see me sometime if you can, every one of you. Come down about apple butter time and just butt in. Goodbye.
End of Uncle Josh Invites the City Folks to Visit Him. Section 36 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Yosemite Jim, or A Tale of the Great White Death.
Yosemite Jim was the name he had, and he came from no one knowed where. Quiet, easy-going sort of a cuss, and was reckoned on the square. Riding a route for the Wells Fargo folks may have made him stern and grim, but there wasn't a man that crossed the divide but'd swear by Yosemite Jim. He warn't one of the regular sort what you'd meet there any day, but as near as the camp could figure it out, in a showdown he'd likely stay. A shambling, awkward figure, raw-boned, tall and slim, and his chaps and his togs in general just looked like they'd fell on him. I was somewhat of a tenderfoot then, hadn't just got the lay of the land. There was a good many things in them there parts as I couldn't quite understand. But I took a liking to Yosemite Jim, was with him on my very first trick, and from that time on I stuck to him like a kitten on a good warm brick. Our headquarters then was the Valley Camp. It was down by the Redwood Way, with Chaparral across the spur, about 50 miles away. Well, what I'm going to tell you, pard, happened there where the trail runs into the sky, and if it hadn't a been for Yosemite Jim, well, I'd be counting my chips on high. The galoot that was punching the broncos for me was a greaser from down Monterey, and Jim used to say, "Keep your eye on him, pard. I don't think he's come for to stay. His eyes are too shifty and yeller, and his face is sullen and hard. And 'tain't that so much as a feeling I have. Anyhow, keep your eye on him, pard." One day when the mercury was way out of sight, and the frost was on every nail, with just the mail sack and the specie box, the greaser and I hit the trail. We picked 2 passengers up at Big Pine, and while the broncos were changed that day, I noticed them having a sneaking chat with the greaser from down Monterey. Did you ever hear tell of the great white death that creeps down the mountainside, leaving behind it a ghastly track where those who met it have died? Well, partner, as true as I'm a living, no man wants to see it twice. White and grim as a funeral shroud, a mass of mist and ice. Well, we hadn't got far from the Big Pine relay when my hair it commenced to rise, for I saw across by the Lone Bear Spur a cloud of most monstrous size. And the greaser acted sort of peculiar, and the broncos commenced to neigh. Well, some thoughts went through my mind just then I won't forget till my dying day. In less time than it takes to tell it, we were into the great white death, with its millions of frozen snowflakes a-taking away our breath. And just then something happened, pard. The greaser from down Monterey tried to sneak off with the specie box, along with the passengers from Big Pine Relay. All at once a figure on horseback come a-whooping it down the trail, and bullets from out of a Winchester commenced to fly like hail. The greaser and them 2 passengers cashed in their chips to him, for the feller what was doing the shooting was my friend Yosemite Jim. Well, we planted them there together when the cloud had passed away, and all they've got for a tombstone is the mountains, dull and gray. So, pard, let's take one together, and I'll drink a toast to him, for though he was rough and ready, he'd a heart, Yosemite Jim. The Great White Death, so named by the Indians, occurs in the higher altitudes of the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains. It is almost indescribable. It might properly be termed a frozen fog. It has the effect of bringing on acute congestion of the lungs, from which few rarely recover. Viewed at a distance, it is a magnificent sight, each and every particle of the frozen moisture being a miniature prism, which reflects the sun's rays in a manner once seen, never to be forgotten. By Cal Stewart, formerly Overland Messenger for the Wells Fargo Express Company. End of Yosemite Jim, or A Tale of the Great White Death. Section 37 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Uncle Josh Weathersby's Trip to Boston. For a long time I had my mind made up to go down to Boston, so a short time ago, as I had all my crops and produce mostly sold, I allowed it would be a good time to go down there, and I said to Mother, I'll start early in the morning and take a load of produce with me, and that will sort of pay expenses for the trip. Well, I got into Boston next morning bright and early, about time they had their breakfast, and I looked round for a spell. Then finally I picked out a right likely-looking store, and I just concluded I'd sell my load of produce there. Well, I went in and I met a feller and I said, "Good morning, be you the storekeeper?" And he said, "No, sir, I'm only one of the clerks." So I said, "Well, be the storekeeper at home?" And he said, "Yes, sir, would you like to see him?" And I told him as how I would, and he turned round and commenced to hollering, "Front!" And a boy come up what had more brass buttons on him than a whole regiment of soldiers. I thought that was a darn funny name for a boy, Front. And that clerk feller, he was about the most important thing I'd seen in Boston so far, lest maybe it was the Bunker Hill Monument that I druv past comin' to town. He had on a biled collar that sort of put me in mind of the whitewashed fence round the fairgrounds down home. I'll bet if he ever sneezed it would cut his ears off. Well, anyhow, he said to that front boy, "Show the gentleman to the proprietor's office." Well, I went along with that boy, and presently we come to a place in one corner of that store. It was made out of iron and had bars in front of the windows and looked like the county jail. The front boy pointed to a man and said, "Go in," and I said I guess I wouldn't go in there 'cause I hadn't done anything to be locked up for. And that front boy commenced to laughin', though derned if I could see what he was a-laughin' about. And the storekeeper, he opened the door and come out, and he said, "Good morning, what can I do for you?" I said, "Be you the storekeeper?" And he said he was. So I said, "Do you want to buy any pertaters?" And he said, "No, sir, we don't buy any pertaters here. This is a dry goods store." So I said, "Well, don't you want any cabbage, do you?" And he said, "No, sir, this is a dry goods store." So I said, "Well, now, I want to know, do you need any onions?" And by chowder, he got madder'n a wet hen. He said, "Now, look here, I want you to understand once for all, this is a dry goods store, and we don't buy anything but dry goods, and don't sell anything but dry goods. Do you understand me now? Dry goods." And I said, "Yes, guess I understand you. You don't need to get so tarnally riled about the matter. Near's I can figure it out, you just buy dry goods and sell 'em." And he said, "Yes, sir, only dry goods." So I said, "Well, do you want to buy some mighty good dried apples?" Well, that front boy got to laughin', and a lot of women clerks giggled right out, and the storekeeper, he commenced to laughin' too, and for about a minute I thought they'd all went crazy at once. Well, he told the feller to show me where I could sell my produce, and I disposed of it at a good bargain. I like them Boston folks. They try to make you feel to home and enjoy yourself and be sociable, and I was chuck full of sociability too. I was going up one street and down t'other just a getting sociability at 10 cents a sociable. Well, I guess I seen about everything worth seeing in Boston. And I was a-standing alongside of one of their old churches a-looking at the cemetery, and I guess there was folks in there buried nigh unto 300 years. And I was just a-thinking what they'd say if they could wake up and see Boston now, when I noticed a little row of tombstones, and on one of them it said Hester Brown, beloved wife of James Brown. And on another it said Prudence Brown, beloved wife of James Brown. And on another it said Thankful Brown, beloved wife of James Brown. Well, I couldn't just make out what she had to be thankful about, but I said, "Jimmy, you had a right lively time while you was in Boston, didn't you?" Then I seen another tombstone, and on it said Matilda Brown, beloved wife of James Brown. And another one what said Sarah Ann Brown, beloved wife of James Brown. And over in a little corner all to itself, I seen a tombstone, and on it said, "James Brown at rest." End of Uncle Josh Weathersby's trip to Boston. Section 38 of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Kyle Stewart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Martin. Who Marched in '61 by Cal Stewart. New York, Memorial Day, 1903. I've just been down at the corner, Mother, to see the boys in line. Dressed up in their brand new uniforms, I tell you they looked fine. And as they marched past where I stood to the rattle of the drum, it made me think of those other boys who marched in '61. The old flag was proudly waving, Mother, just as it did one day when you stood there to say goodbye and watch me march away. So I stood there and watched them till the parade was nearly done, but there wasn't many there today who marched in '61. And there was my old captain and the colonel side by side, and as they both saluted me I just sat down and cried. And I thought about some other boys whose work has long been done. Soon there won't be any left at all who marched in '61. I heard the band play Dixie, and my old heart swelled with pride, a-thinking of the boys in gray who marched on t'other side. And when my time it comes, Mother, the Lord will make it done. I hope He'll take me to the boys who marched in '61. End of Who Marched in '61. Also, end of Uncle Josh's Punkin Center Stories by Cal Stewart.